Good evening. I'm Bee Moorhead, Director of Texas Impact. I'm so honored to be part of this summit. For the next few minutes, I want us to think together about 4 key questions regarding the role of U.S. faith communities in addressing climate change. In my talk, I'm going to be sharing video clips from Texas Impact's 4-part climate study called The Path of Hope. The Path of Hope uses video from the 2019 United Nations climate negotiations in Madrid, COP25, including interviews with U.S. faith leaders, representatives of frontline communities, and climate policy experts to explain how climate change is impacting core concerns of the church, like hunger, health, and immigration. I hope my presentation inspires you and your Sunday school class or other small group to check out this study, which is available at thepathofhope.org. Now, with so many crises going on right now, it can be tough to focus. We need to move from worry to work. That can be challenging, but as faith communities, we're able to see how the crises we're facing in this moment, as well as long-standing concerns of faith communities, all are related. We can use our knowledge and experience gained from our many kinds of ministries to draw connections and identify how the solution to one kind of problem could also alleviate other concerns. So the 4 questions I want us to think about are, first, how U.S. faith communities already are involved in global climate policy. Second, why exactly do people of faith care about climate policy? Why are faith voices necessary to advancing climate policy? And finally, how can people of faith, especially Americans of faith, lead on global climate policy? So let's start by talking about how faith communities are involved in global climate policy. Linnea Main is the Episcopal Church's staff liaison to the United Nations. We asked her to explain how faith communities participate in the UN climate process.
The word COP has nothing to do with law enforcement, although in some ways it does, but it's called the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The parties are the actual signatories to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the major piece of international legislation around the environment and climate that came into force around 2000. So the United Nations is made up of countries, member states as we call them. So there are member states, which consist of governments, and then we have another sector called non-governmental organizations, or you may hear it referred to as civil society, which is the rest of us. So that could include companies, it can include universities, trade unions, and it also includes faith-based organizations. We are here to observe and not to vote or make decisions at the COP. That said, the role we have here is very, very important all the same. One of the big issues at this COP that we have been working on is making sure that the voices of the most vulnerable and their situations are not forgotten.
Faith communities all over the world participate in the climate process at the UN, but faith communities in the United States have a special role right now. Because right now, the U.S. is not providing all the leadership that it can or should on the global stage. Ilka Vega and Tracy DePasquale are lay leaders from the United States who attended the Madrid climate negotiations. I'll let them explain more.
It's at the best interest of the United States to care about the issues of the world and build solidarity and be in full commitment to our international community, right? Because this is something that we have to do together. So let's make sure we're leading this conversation about climate and not staying behind.
I think we've been lulled into a sense of powerlessness. And I want to help us to also realize that in global terms, we have access to great power and we should steward that because it all belongs to God. And at different times in the world's history, we may have been slow to act when we were needed. And I want to remind us as Americans that we don't want to be slow to respond again.
So The next question is why people of faith care about climate policy. There are a lot of reasons that faith communities care about climate change, and I know that you'll unpack a lot of them during this summit. But a lot of the things that we're concerned about have to do with policy, and I want us to think particularly about two statements. First, climate change is hurting and killing vulnerable people. And second, climate change is doing damage that can't be undone. In this next video, we'll hear from siblings across the global community about the impacts climate change is already having and will have in the future.
I stand here representing the collective voice of 44 low-lying island and coastal countries whose existence is on the line. Steady, unrelenting rise of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere with no end in sight conscribe us to an unrecognizable and insecure future.
I come from the island state of Tasmania, from the southernmost community in Australia. My name is Toby. Our oceans are warming. The iconic Great Barrier Reef is bleaching. Our country is quite literally on fire, and our Pacific neighbours are sinking. Climate change is affecting every aspect of our lives right now. It is not a future thing.
Even without emitting greenhouse gases, we suffer the disasters caused by climate change, lengthy drought, increase in the diseases which have been carried by mosquitoes, also serious losses in the livestock sector of my country. This generates food insecurity. It causes economic losses and increasing migration from the country to cities.
9 million Africans are facing food shortage, and that number is going to go up to 45 million in the next 6 months.
Internationally, we're seeing migration towards North America and Europe. Our migrants are in a situation of real vulnerability, and this in turn has sparked humanitarian crisis.
We're learning every day about how our ministries with migration, for instance, touch on the realities of climate change. I think we've been doing this for decades and decades, but now we're learning to ask those questions. What brings these people to our shores in such need? And for many, many folks, it is the impact of climate change.
Anytime there's a natural disaster, the folks that are affected the most are the people that can handle it the least. And when these big storms come through and wreak all this havoc, there's not the infrastructure, there's not the safety nets.
There's a lot of grief that's buried in the conversation because it is about, a lot of it's about loss and damage. A lot of it is about people losing their human rights. They're losing their homes. People are going to lose their access to their fishery or the lands that they were able to farm.
Loss and damage is linked to loss of property, loss of livelihoods, loss of sectors that provide economic growth to specific countries.
I want to talk about somebody that I met in Bangladesh. Mohammed, I met, he was displaced. That means his home was lost 19 times in 20 years. Can you imagine what that's like? His situation was that the seas were rising up, the land was eroding, all his crops. He was a well-off rice farmer. Don't get me wrong, he's not a poor man. He had a family, they were getting an education, they were doing all the stuff that people should be doing when they're striving to make a better life. But then the weather came. It took away that life. It took away the very land that he was standing on.
The effects aren't only limited to developing countries. In fact, we do experience them in North America. For example, when we see hurricanes and floods affecting our coastlines, that's some substantial damage that people are facing.
Pennsylvania is one of the most, if not the most, flood-prone state in the United States. It's all hills and valleys, and they are flooding again and again and again. It is the marginalized communities, low-lying areas, communities of color, small town after small town. Their towns are not going to exist much longer.
We're subsistence fishermen. We rely on the resources that are provided to us to live, and it's part of our cultural heritage. Now, in order to move forward, we need support in order to adapt and to thrive.
que tenemos que cambiar de modelo, un nuevo paradigma, porque no hay otro planeta. Y si bien es cierto, como decíamos, en este tema del cambio climático es como un barco, pero es un barco que todos no se van a salvar. Los que más vamos a perder somos los trabajadores, las trabajadoras, los pueblos indígenas, porque es un barco que se llama el planeta Tierra, pero que hay pasajeros de primera, segunda y tercera categoría.
It can be tough to hear those stories, and it definitely convinces us that climate change is doing damage and we need to take action. But a lot of people wonder about the unique role of faith voices in the climate debate. After all, climate change is mainly about science, right? Well, the truth is, climate change is a scientific issue, but climate policy is primarily about money. Whenever we start talking about money, we know that conflict can't be far behind, because conversations about money are conversations about values.
I think it's really important for us to keep focused on the fact that when countries come to these international conversations, they can only commit internationally what they can deliver domestically. We have to make sure that those of us then go back to the United States and do strong advocacy for action domestically to ramp up finance, to take down our emissions, and to address loss and damage.
There are numerous analyses now indicate that we will need at least $300 billion a year by 2030, and the amount may go up to $1.2 trillion a year. So that's the scale of damage we need to deal with. And unless we have an institutionalized response, a system that helps people in developing countries, we will not be doing justice to people who are not even responsible for the crisis.
When you're surrounded by the rest of the world, your siblings from around the globe, and you know the suffering that's going on in their countries, you want to help much more than we are right now. It's very hard to face that suffering when people just are saying help.
I don't understand how we, knowing where we've come from as a Black community, how we know our history and how we've had to fight and struggle to be where we are, and still not have anything but fiddles, but not be concerned about somebody else.
The underlying tension about money in climate policy is one reason that it's so important for people of faith to speak up. We as faith communities are used to having uncomfortable conversations about money because our scripture and traditions could not be clearer that the way we use our resources reflects our values. And we can talk about that.
I think for me, ultimately, this goes back to common values. And I think that can resonate in a bipartisan way in the US as well. What do we have in common? You know, what do we love, right? What do we care about?
We might not be scientists, but we invest our money, we take our time, we do our ministry focus, and we have lots to think about how to make the world livable. And we do that because we're people of faith. And so learning just to use those words to have confidence in our ability to tell our story is really important.
This is hard. One thing to recognize is that there's a silence around this. Like when you talk about this, people just shut the conversation down. And that's very hard. So I think we have to recognize if you care about this stuff, it's going to be challenging.
We can come to this from the moral standpoint and talk about how we not only have a moral obligation to protect this planet for our children and our grandchildren, but we also have a moral opportunity to lead.
I went to seminary to preach. My whole goal, I'm born and raised in the Black Pentecostal church. I went to seminary to shout them. We wanted to dance all over the place, scream and holler, but I think this crisis has really caused us and called for us to be a little bit more diligent and serious about what we're doing. Because at this point, it's not just about how we live good, but it's about how we live, period.
So you believe the science, you see the suffering, your faith impels you to take action. What kind of action would help? At this summit, you're going to learn about lots of ways to take action for the creation, and they're all important. But at this moment in the United States, the action we really need is citizen advocacy at the federal level related to global climate policy. This is not just about staying in the Paris Agreement. It's about a hard push that Congress needs to make in 2021 to pass bold US climate legislation. Congress needs to hear strong constituent support, and the members of Congress that we've talked to say they specifically want to hear from you.
We had the opportunity at this COP to meet with the US delegation from Congress. It was a bicameral delegation led by Speaker Pelosi.
We're here to talk positively about our agenda to save the planet for future generations.
And to a person, they said they needed to hear more from people of faith in their communities, hear from it from the pulpit, hear from it into their offices. So I think the first and foremost that folks can do is speak up and speak out.
The U.S. House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis published its climate report in July. Since then, there's been a lot going on. But regardless of how the November election turns out, come January, the House will start considering legislation around the dozens of recommendations in this report. You can help by meeting on Zoom or by phone with your congressional representative. Make sure they've read the report and discuss with them which recommendations they can support. If you need help setting up a meeting, you can contact Texas Impact, and if you're not in Texas, we can connect you to someone in your state. In November of 2021, the nations of the world will gather in Scotland for COP26. It's really important that when they do, the US is back on track, leading by example and ready to help the world move forward. Your voice matters. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be walking the path of hope with you.